better, they will probably be a little difficult in terms of the impact of those measures into Brazilian growth. And we are already seeing, as I said, a negative growth rate this year, but we see the prospects for the next coming years as Brazil coming out of this situation stronger, more streamlined, and with a greater focus on its development. So this is very much part of a process in which this country, which is very dynamic and in many respects, like I said, resembles India in its imbalances, in its regional disparities, in its need for greater involvement of the private sector in some sectors where the government is not able to fully inject the investment those sectors need. Brazil is looking forward to an upturn in its economic growth from 2016 on. Well, I have here a chart that shows, I don't know whether it's really, you can see it especially from the back of the room, but it shows the comparative growth rates for various countries, and you see there the two big columns on the left are India and China. I think very much stars of these growth rates, and then the third sort of set of columns as emerging countries. You see that there continue to drive actually world growth, and you see Brazil really right now at the right-hand segment there. It has a pretty lackluster kind of performance. 0.1% growth rate last year, -1 this year. But then the blue column there says that it will be picking up from 2016 on. And these are projections from Bloomberg and the IMF. So we do see the country picking up as after it sort of goes through this period of adjustment. Another chart which I think is also interesting for you to see is precisely what I was mentioning regarding the major strides that were made in Brazil in terms of reducing the inequality that marks its society. And this shows the Gini index and the proportion of the population that lives below the line of poverty. And you see there the blue chart, the Gini index steadily declining from around 0.54 down to 0.5, and the amount of the percentage of the Brazilian population almost coming down by half the number of poor people, so that today Brazil has around, it says there 15%, but I think it's even lower than that. It's around 18 million people out of a population of 200 million. So it's something that really has been a major achievement over the past decade or so. Now, Brazilian foreign policy, a word on that. Minister Mauro Vieira, Minister of External Relations of Brazil, former ambassador of Brazil to Argentina and to the USA. Brazilian foreign policy is very much set on supporting the type of adjustment that Brazil is going through right now in this first year of the second mandate of President Dilma Rousseff. Special focus on commercial and economic diplomatic activities, and what is called a results-oriented diplomacy in support of the nation's current economic and trade effort. And we are very much set on that and on trying to explain and trying to put forward the types of economic policies that will guide Brazil in this beginning of the second mandate of President Dilma Rousseff. Brazil-India relations. These are very interesting and very dynamic relations. They are also growing relations. Recent meetings, Prime Minister Modi and President Dilma Rousseff have met several times. More recently in Brasilia last year on the occasion of the BRICS, and even more recently in Ufa in Russia just this month. BRICS summits and other occasions are usual venues for presidents to meet at that level, but also bilateral visits usually take place when they visit each other's countries. This was the case last year when Prime Minister Modi visited Brazil for the BRICS summit in Fortaleza, northeastern Brazil, and then he went on to the capital, to Brasilia, to be hosted by President Dilma, and also to have meetings with the other South American presidents. So that was also an occasion for the Prime Minister to meet with Brazil's neighboring countries. And this was done actually by Russia also in Ufa, by bringing in Central Asian countries to meet the BRICS leaders. So these are usually not just have a bilateral effect, but are also very useful for the reciprocal BRICS leaders to meet the regions where the countries of the region where the meetings take place. Brazil also in India, we have a sort of biannual high-level joint commission, and the last meeting was in Brasilia in 2013. Then Foreign Minister Khurshid was there. And well, this year, before the end of the year, it's possible that we'll have another meeting like that in Delhi. President Rousseff, as I mentioned, visited India in 2012 for BRICS, and she stayed on for a bilateral visit as well. And we have regular joint commission meetings, that's the minister level interaction. And the interactions that take place in a meeting like that lead to a number of agreements, a number of facilitations. I put here a few of these areas in consular affairs. They're easy. We have now easier short-term work visas for Indians in Brazil, visa on arrival facility for Brazilian tourists in this country. Arrangements like that facilitate the interaction between the two countries. There is also a very significant growth in the level of trade between Brazil and India, and this is being sustained at over $10 billion bilateral trade, which is no small amount, even though we still see a lot of room for growth. And also we are witnessing an increasing interest on the part of Indian investors in Brazil and vice versa, of Brazilian investors in India, as they increasingly realize the potential that both countries have, even though they do not have a very long tradition of investing directly between these two countries. They're more used to their traditional partners, usually the developed countries. But this increase in trade, I think, is very significant. And here's a chart that shows you that Brazilian exports to India and Indian exports to Brazil. You see there the bilateral trade. It has gone up from around, the first year in the chart is 1989. At that time, there was around 230 million US dollars. And this has steadily grown, and from the 2000 decade we see a real jump up to over $10 billion. Then there was a small decline in 2013. It has gone up again above 10 billion. So $10 billion. So we see there really a very significant growth. Of course, it's very impressive. It shows that the countries are more integrated, are trading more, are exchanging goods and services and people more. But it's still a relatively unbalanced trade, because almost half of this trade is made up of oil. Oil that's sold from Brazil to India, and more or less half of the trade from India to Brazil consists of diesel fuel. So we have these curiosities when we look at these charts. So even though it's very significant, we have to keep on working to make our trade more diversified, make our trade more value intensive and not just in raw materials, even though of course raw materials are also important to be traded between the two countries. Now here maybe it's also again a little bit too small, but you see in the chart is essentially the increase in the visas issued by our embassy here in New Delhi and the Brazilian consulate in Mumbai. And we also see there a doubling of, almost doubling of the number of total visas from 2010 to 2013. And so we see that this trade and this increased interaction is really generating a greater movement of people. It's still very small in terms of absolute numbers, because if we look at the numbers, we see that it's around 12,000, which is very, very little, particularly if we take the population of this country and even that of Brazil. So we see a big room for growth. We see an immense space for both countries to take advantage of in the coming years. Future prospects. The relationship between India and Brazil, I think, is a very multifaceted as their societies. It has a political side. Brazil and India usually have very similar positions on many international issues. As we have seen, economic and trade is becoming even more significant than it was. Consular, which is a reflection of that, of people moving and taking up jobs or visiting or doing business. Science and technology also, there has been some interchange in that area, and both countries are relatively unknown to each other in those areas. This is changing. In defense too, both countries have been cooperating. They have some joint projects that they're doing in defense, some of it in high technology areas. There are many other new areas of cooperation. Last year I received here in Delhi the Brazilian Electoral Commissioner, which put forward some ideas regarding cooperation in elections, which is something also that this country is very competent in doing, and so is Brazil, because we are big countries. We have to make a lot of people vote, and we do so in a very efficient way. And this is in a very, not just efficient, but a very trustworthy and credible way. And this is another area where Brazil and India could cooperate a lot. Other areas, of course, agriculture. This is a very big agricultural country. So is Brazil, even though the markets have their own ways for the time being. This country needs a certain level of protection and a certain level of food security, but in the future we see a lot of potential for greater trade and for greater cooperation. Brazil also is a very big agricultural country, exports a lot, and also has devised a lot of expertise in the types of crops and plants and seeds, just like India, which are very adapted to its own climatic conditions. And because of various reasons, these are very relevant for other countries that have similar soil or climatic conditions. And this, in general, are countries that lie in the subtropical or tropical belt around the world. So not just Brazil, India, but Brazil, India can cooperate with third countries in Africa, for example. So this is also a very big field that will, no doubt, grow a lot in the next coming years. Diplomatic policy planning, a completely different area, but it's one that also I think is relevant because both countries see many issues in a similar way, international issues. And these are just a few areas where we will probably see a lot more interaction and growth. The two countries, Brazil and India, I think have a lot in common, as we are very keenly aware of. Their views are more or less similar on international issues, but also their aspirations are also similar in the sense that they want to play a greater role internationally. And I think this is very clear in this country. It's also clear in Brazil. We have that kind of position in part because we have already been able to come up with our own answers to our own internal issues. And I think that this is, if there is one issue that has been very much part of the internal agenda, is the development issue, because the strides that have been made in that area. I think what we have achieved in Brazil, this country has also achieved a lot, and we are right now in the process of consolidating that and making sure that we continue along this path. I think prospects are similar. I brought here some quotation from Foreign Affairs Minister Sushma Swaraj, and where she says that we believe that our cooperation with Brazil is limited not by distance, but our imagination and efforts. We intend to further intensify our growing relationship. So just as Brazil has this intention of doing that, I think this is reciprocal on the part of India, and there you have the minister herself saying that, and we will be working and continue to work in that direction. A few considerations on multilateral issues now, Brazil and India and the contemporary world. As I mentioned before, Brazil and India have very similar views on several international issues. One case in point is the environment, where not just they see the main questions regarding to that in a similar way, but they also today, as with other big countries, they cannot be ignored. I mean, there cannot be a major international agreement on an issue such as the environment without the participation of countries like Brazil and India. But these similar views, they are relevant because not just because they see the same issue in the same light, but that because they usually don't have confrontational views on most major political, security and global issues that come before the international fora, the UN, the WTO, and other fora. And what I was saying about aspirations being similar too, that has to do with the Security Council and the IMF and the World Bank. These are institutions that were devised in the 1940s after the Second World War, and that have not been, or very little, adapted since then. So, with regard to the United Nations Security Council, both Brazil and India believe that there should be an expansion and that new permanent members should be admitted, and that this should be done in a way that the Council becomes more representative and more legitimate. And they believe once this is done, the Council will become more effective in dealing with international security issues. Similar views with regard to the IMF and the World Bank. They believe that their weight in international trade and international economic affairs warrants an increase in their quotas in those institutions. And they have been working towards that jointly, also with other countries, to reduce the imbalances that currently exist in these institutions. There are other areas in which they cooperate a lot. One is peacekeeping operations. Brazil also is a troop contributing country, although not in the same scale as India, but it's very interested in participating in peacekeeping activities and in doing so in reducing tensions in various parts of the world, and also in confronting the threat of terrorism. Brazil is also very much engaged in that, and the economic and social and environmental issues also are issues where Brazil and India usually see, if not exactly the same positions, very similar ones. So this gives both countries a lot of scope for continuing their ongoing political cooperation in multilateral institutions. I will also mention some other smaller institutions. One of them is IPSA, India, Brazil, and South Africa, three major developing countries from three different areas of the world: Asia, Africa, Latin America. They have, even though their leaders have not met for a few years, but this group has been important in terms of promoting the assets that these three countries have, precisely in having resolved, or at least working to resolve, many of their internal issues, and being able to share those experiences with other countries, developing countries, mainly from Africa, from Asia, from Latin America, but smaller countries that don't have the same kinds of resources, not just financial resources, but in terms of the expertise and the institutions that are needed for these solutions to emerge